Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to joining us at the Woodrow Wilson Center, the National Memorial to the 28th President of the United States. My name is Robert Daly. I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center. It has been, as you no doubt all know, an extremely active year in Chinese diplomacy. Premier Li Keqiang was in India in May. Xi Jinping in September stopped in Central Europe and hit all of the Central Asian capitals on his way to and from Russia. In late October, then, there was in Beijing a major conference on peripheral diplomacy, the Peripheral Diplomacy Work Conference of the CPC Central Committee. This was followed by a visit by China's leaders to Southeast Asia while President Obama was here in Washington during the government shutdown. And then throughout this period, you've no doubt been following the drama in the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, most recently the announcement of a Chinese air defense identification zone on November 23rd. And now we've just learned that in December 5th, there was a confrontation in or near the South China Sea between an American guided missile cruiser and a Chinese ship that was accompanying the Liaoning, China's aircraft carrier, on its cruise in the South China Sea. As all of these activities raise major questions about China's strategy in East Asia, and then, of course, corresponding questions about whether the United States has an adequate strategy in the area. This was raised most recently in The American Interest by Walter Russell Mead in his article on The End of History Ends, in which he calls for a new comprehensive American Eurasia strategy. We are honored this morning to have Edward Luttwak with us to discuss Chinese strategy on its periphery. Professor Luttwak is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington and is a renowned military strategist, political scientist, and historian. He has served as a consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, and the United States Department of State, as well as the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and a number of the United States allied governments. He's also the author of numerous articles and several books, including Coup d'etat, a practical handbook, first published in 1968 and published continually since, The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, 1976, his textbook, which is widely used in war colleges and in universities, which is called Strategy, The Logic of War and Peace, first published in 2001, and then most recently, The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy, 2012. You'll also see his articles frequently in major publications, including in 2013, a piece in the New York Times, In Syria, America Loses If Either Side Wins, and then Take It and Like It, Why Obama Should Be Thrilled About the Russian Chemical Weapons Deal, which was published in Foreign Policy, and also in Foreign Policy recently, 5 Rules for Arming Rebels. Before going to war in Syria, the Obama administration should heed the lessons of history. So we will lead off this morning with Professor Luttwak giving his views on Chinese strategy, and then we are honored to have Ambassador Stapleton Roy as the discussant for the talk. Ambassador Roy is known to most of you in the room. He's now a distinguished scholar here at the Wilson Center, affiliated with the Kissinger Institute, but he is founding director of the Kissinger Institute as well, and during his long and distinguished service in the Foreign Service, he was our ambassador to Singapore, Beijing, and Indonesia. Welcome, Ambassador Roy. So with that, Professor Luttwak, if you would please start off.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming in this cold morning. So I have to confess, 3 confessions, first of all, even before being interrogated. First confession is that I first met Ambassador Roy on the eve of my first trip to China with former Secretary of Defense Schlesinger at the invitation of the Chinese Defense Ministry in 1976. So that by chance, after more than a month in China, I happened to be there where Mao died. So I'm confessing I'm that old. And in fact, had the very strange experience of being in the House of the People, in the first group of privileged Mao mourners with the 4 members of the Gang of 4, Wang Wenwen and Xi Jinping, plus the other favorite friends, who were the North Koreans, with whom we could not talk, the North Vietnamese, with whom we could not talk, the Khmer Rouge, with whom we could not talk, and the Romanian ambassador, who was running between all of us. He talked a lot. So that visit in China was in the context of the first American meeting with China, and had very important consequences, because I was there as strangely enough, as a tactical military expert, and I advised Marshal Ye Chen to buy the guns for the Chinese tanks, which was the very first Chinese purchase made, which they made very quickly, 105 guns right away. That was an important piece of consulting. Somebody else earned several $100 million, but I couldn't get a commission. The second, that's confession number one. Confession number two is that even though I became interested in China in all those years, I failed to become a sinologist, because my interest, unfortunately, is strategy, which is a much inferior field than sinology, has no serious body of knowledge, no formal study, and it's an endless, as I would claim, endless paradoxes and contradictions and so on. And now, the final confession I have to make is that my starting point in the presentation today is quite an emotional starting point, not an intellectual starting point. In 1976, I went all over China, have been traveling in China ever since then, reasonably often over the years. And so, from an emotional point of view, I cannot overcome the feeling of pleasure, satisfaction, real pleasure in seeing the people in China who were sunk in 1976 in miserable, smelly poverty. Everywhere was stinking from this night soil, wearing horrible clothes, many of them unable to wash with hot water or any water for days at a time, and to see them lift up to the present situation where the world's best disco, in my opinion, is in Beijing. It's called Chocolat. I recommend it. Has a very high ceiling, so that even when they smoked, there was good air. So whenever I think about China, I always do so with this feeling of great pleasure and satisfaction about the rise of China. For me, the rise of China is an overwhelmingly positive human sentiment. As a strategist, however, I now believe that this story is going to end very badly indeed. And the reason is, unfortunately, extremely familiar. Start with the context. We are in a context where Chinese economic growth is extremely rapid, as everybody knows, slows down from whatever number it was, 12 or 13, slows down to 7. Maybe it will slow down to 6. It's still 2 or 3 times faster than anybody else. So you have a country, and its economy is growing very much. Secondly, this is not a small country. It's a very big country. Now, when a very big country is just growing economically, and with it is growing its implicit economic power, because the ability to invest, not invest, buy, not buy, and so on, then it's like a person entering an elevator where there are the people in the elevator, and this person is very fat, and this person is growing very quickly. Now, this person has to be extremely polite. If this person is not very humble, modest, and polite, it will be rejected by the people in the elevator, who cannot tolerate this and were afraid they will be crushed. And that is why in the whole history of strategy, there is a particular way to rise while avoiding conflict. The Chinese leadership found that particular way, and it was called peaceful rise. Peaceful rise. James Bizan, who is a friend of mine, personal friend, is the one who made the speech called Peaceful Rise. Then it was called Peaceful Development. Made it at one of the Hainan conferences and so on. And Peaceful Rise meant, yes, we're getting bigger and stronger and so on, but we will rigorously not project power, we will not assert power, and we will behave rationally. When you're growing this fast, you don't want to make any claims, because any claims you have, you should wait 10 years to make them, because then you will get what you want just by asking for it. If you ask for it too quickly, people will get alarmed and start reacting against you. So this is what's been happening. It seems almost incredible now, but it was only 3 years ago, 3.5 or whatever, that Mr. Ozawa, the Japanese big man, goes to Beijing with hundreds of people in what is a classic mission to the emperor. And he brings with him the defense minister. Defense minister signs an agreement for all kinds of cooperation between Japan and China with the defense minister and so on, only a few years ago. What happens next? Instead of sitting there in Beijing and waiting for the Japanese to complete the transition from American influence to Chinese influence, transition from Washington to Beijing, which people like former Prime Minister Nakasone have been talking about for many years. Instead of waiting, they start kicking Japan on the Senkaku Islands or the Altai, whatever you call it, unilaterally provoking a fight over stupid islands. Now, here I have to interrupt and remind you the island issue in world history. In 1982, when the British were risking the entire Navy, their military prestige, the whole superstructure, from the Queen to the Army and everything else, on the Falkland Islands, hard people explained to me all over the world that the British were doing it because there is a lot of oil there. Of course, there was no oil. There was not, countries don't do that sort of thing. Private people act rationally to get things. You know, countries get into fight over islands. The issue is, why did it happen? Cannot be explained. If you start talking China, Japan, you're already on the wrong road. Don't say a word about who really owns these islands. Personally, I was born in Transylvania, and I want to assure you that these islands belong to us. It's well known in Transylvanian circles. We have very old Transylvanian documents about how we actually own the islands. Why is it entirely irrelevant to talk about China and Japan? Because at the same time, China found a quarrel with the Philippines. It's very hard to quarrel with the Philippines. They're not a quarrelsome people. They have rarely invaded, attacked, or bombed countries. To quarrel with them, you have to make a real effort. China succeeded. Then there is the quarrel with India. The China-India border dispute goes back to before 1949. It's a very old dispute. But for many, many years, it was sleeping and forgotten, until it was raised, not by the Chinese Air Force, Navy, or whatever, but raised by the Bank of China representative at the Asian Development Bank meeting in Manila, where suddenly he raises his little hand and says, you can't do this particular road project because it is extending from Assam province into Arunachal Pradesh, which is what the Indians call Arunachal Pradesh, actually South Tibet. By calling it South Tibet, of course, you raise a whole other issue, which is not so clever, but it was done, blocked the thing, and suddenly all over the Indian newspapers, it was written the following thing, that China claims the whole 97% of the state of Arunachal Pradesh is claimed by China. Of course, this is not a new thing at all. This had been on the books for a long, long time, but it was not a political reality in India. And that starts then, and of course, just before the Prime Minister's visit that Mr. Daly mentioned, just a month before, there was the intrusion of troops in Ladakh, crossing the border. I happened to be in Delhi. I happened to be with the actual national security advisor when it happened and so on and so forth. And the Indians couldn't believe it. They said, grabbing this piece of territory is a good idea militarily, because they took a nice piece of territory, the entrance of the famous Karakoram Pass. But the timing is strange because the prime minister is supposed to come to Delhi. Now we will stop the visit and they'll have to withdraw. And that's exactly what the Indians did. They said, if you don't withdraw, no prime minister visit, therefore no visit of Xi to Beijing to meet Xi Jinping, and the Chinese troops withdraw. Then there is Vietnam. Again, a very old quarrel. But with Vietnam, there was a huge increase in activity in the last couple of years. There was the establishment of the Xinsha County Administration for all these islands and so on. And the whole activity level with Vietnam was raised to the point where, from refusing anchorage to the US Navy offshore, it goes to them begging for the US Navy to visit Vietnam. The US Ronald Reagan, the name of the building, visits Vietnam. 300 members of the Central Committee, Politburo, military chiefs, others come aboard the aircraft carrier with helicopters from Hanoi. And since that time, there is a US ship being repaired in Vietnam, and so on. So in other words, the quarreling is not with Japan. The quarreling is with everybody on the east side. At the same time, no quarreling on the west side at all. Chinese claims to places like Zaisan Lake are pretty good case. Those were 1890, whatever, the Beijing Convention and so on. 1893 land grabs and so on, but silence. Silence with Moscow, and that shows that, you know, at least some sense about limits. Now, the quarreling is generic. The quarreling is accompanied by the issue of the new passport with the big map of China, the claim for 3 million square miles of the South China Sea, which is problematic because the South China Sea is 3 million kilometers squared, and there's a difference, and so on and so forth. Now, this all needs to be explained. It needs to be explained because if you are rising economically at this rate, and your power to give or withhold investments keeps increasing, your power to open your market or close your market keeps increasing, it makes no sense to quarrel with your customers. And it certainly makes no sense to quarrel at the same time with everybody, including quarreling with Japan, Vietnam, and India. The three countries between them have more people than China, more money than China, and arguably more technology, or at least as much. And besides, I'm told that of these, Japan and Vietnam and India actually have some allies. One of these allies, a humble ally, is the United States. Now, the United States, of course, the Obama administration is criticized by many people, including myself, for almost everything. But certainly you cannot criticize that they've been asleep on this issue. The reaction of Hillary Clinton's State Department, if anything, was very immediate, vigorous, loud, rich in initiatives from the South Mekong issue about fish and everything, which is a nice way to say South Mekong, because the Upper Mekong is, of course, would bring in China. When you drive on the beautiful, beautiful road from Dali to Lijiang, you drive right over the Mekong. So from the Lower Mekong Initiative indirectness to conspiring with the Marine Corps to send 1,000 people to Darwin, Australia. Although it is a rather nice place on the whole. It's only 500 nautical miles from Bali. Bali is, everybody there can do the weekend in Bali and so on. I understand all that, but what the United States is doing is the normal thing that a great power does to maintain its position, which is reacting and taking advantage. But the American role is such a weak role, so weak, compared to the Chinese role, because China has succeeded in creating an anti-China coalition all by itself. Even though our State Department was very much active in everything, all the work was done by Beijing, not Washington. It was Beijing that, for example, persuaded the Japanese to give money to Vietnam, and so the Vietnamese could buy Russian submarines. And since it takes a long time to adopt submarines for a new country, the Indians came and said, we use the same submarine, and you can use our training facilities when the Russian submarines arrive so that you can train up and be operational in 18 months instead of 7 years. So this cooperation between India, Japan, and Vietnam was extremely difficult to achieve. But it was achieved by Beijing by simply quarreling with all three countries at the same time. So whatever your purposes are, you don't quarrel with everybody at the same time. You're supposed to quarrel with people one at a time. But if you're getting so rich so fast, you wouldn't quarrel at all. Couple of remarks. Why am I sort of pessimistic about outcomes? I'm pessimistic about outcomes because there appear to be incentives built into the system in China that reward tactical adventurism. Tactical adventurism. For example, I said I was in Beijing, in Delhi by chance when the intrusion took place. It was noted at the time that in the entirety of the border with China, everything was totally quiet and normal, all the way from east to Ladakh. And everything west of a particular line, everybody was on alert on the Chinese side. That's a break between the Chengdu military region, Chengdu military region commander controls most of the border, and that small piece, Lanzhou military region. Lanzhou, long way, they control a piece of the border. The border is divided by two military regions. In one, maximum alert, in the other, complete normal behavior patrolling. Second, tactical adventurism. There's been adventuristic behavior around Senkaku. And why do I call it adventuristic? Because if there is an actual fight between Japanese and Chinese ships, the Chinese ships will be sunk very quickly. They will disappear. It will be 1895 all over again. There's a huge tactical difference between the Japanese and the Chinese side. Chinese side is making big progress. In 5, 7, 10 years, they will be able to have the same level of response. Not now. And tactical adventurism, another example was mentioned, was the question of the USS Cowpens. Cowpens is not a very impressive name, but the ship is impressive. They call it a destroyer. It's actually a cruiser. It's almost 9,000 tons. It has 2 magazines in them, which called vertical launch magazines. If you put anti-ship missiles in those magazines, and these magazines are used for anti-submarine, for anti-air, and everything, if they're anti-ship, they can sink the entire Chinese fleet. I mean, one of those 2 magazines can sink the entire fleet of major vessels. So when you block such a ship with your tank landing ship, which, as you know, is a steel box and so on, and the next day, instead of saying this is a very adventurous thing to do, don't do it, Global Times yesterday, and not it was the next day, 2 weeks later actually it happened because it was reported very late. Global Times comes out and say, well, the US ships came within 45 kilometers of the Chinese ships. So suddenly, a new doctrine has been invented by Global Times in one day, or at least in 2 weeks, max. The doctrine that you cannot come within 45 kilometers. Like the same thing was with the ADIZ. By the way, there's been a huge misunderstanding. You all know. I happen to be in aviation business. ADZ is just an identification zone. Nothing more, identification zone. You come in, you say who you are, fine. And it's presented as an air defense zone. When it was presented as if you don't identify yourself, you'll be shot down and stuff like that. All of this is what Marxist-Leninists called adventurism. And adventurism is the right behavior for a small aggressive country, very small, aggressive country that wants to attract a lot of attention and get leverage from people who say, these guys are small but unpredictable. It's completely wrong for a big country. So I must conclude that somebody in Beijing believes that this adventurism is actually useful because it will frighten and intimidate people. And being frightened and intimidated, they will step back. As they step back, China goes forward. Well, let me tell you, this brings up the final point, which is inability to understand foreign countries. For example, Chinese people all over the world understand foreign countries and live in them successfully and progress and become ambassadors and big businessmen, scientists and professors and everything else. Beijing, however, appears to understand nobody. For example, they didn't understand that they were causing Vietnam, India, and Japan to become a naval alliance, which is growing and developing. And remember, the Japanese are spending less than 1% of their GDP, of their economy on defense, which means that they could double it tomorrow. Their budget situation is terrible, but from 1% to 2%, it makes no difference. So many questions need to be answered, but I believe that what's going on, and I will finish with this, is the triumph of emotion over the mind, the triumph of feeling over the mind. We've seen this before. And that's why many sinologists have evoked the example of Germany in 1914. Germany in 1914 had the world's largest bank, Deutsche Bank, and there were others, had the world's best universities, which everybody tried to copy, had the world's most advanced chemical electrical industry. In fact, Germany was so superior to everybody else that all they had to do was to have no army, no navy, and they would become the kings of Europe, which is exactly what now is happening because they have no army and no navy, the kings of Europe. So why didn't they do it in 1914? Emotion. Emotion. This feeling you have to assert yourself. Germany was, as you know, divided, while everybody else was not divided. They were invaded, they were conquered, they were, and they accumulated these feelings. Unity was new in 1870, only 2 generations had passed, about the time from 1949 to the present. And the overwhelming feeling that you want to beat foreigners, defeat foreigners, humiliate foreigners, overcame rational mind that says, do nothing, just wait. And indeed, that is what we see today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Luttbach. Ambassador Roy, comments, please, thoughts?
Thank you for a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. For those of you who haven't read Dr. Littbach's book, The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy, I highly recommend it to you. Back in the 1970s, I spent a year at the National War College from 74 to 75. And I decided when I was assigned there to rigorously do all of the reading assignments, so that whenever a class was over, I retired to the library and I would spend 3 or 4 hours doing all of the reading assignments. And we had a great deal of reading. One of the reasons I did that was because in my earlier jobs, I've been spending 9 years working on the Soviet Union, and that was a busy time, and you never had enough chance to read the things you needed to be well informed about what you were doing. So this is an opportunity to make up for the deficit. And I found that 80% of the reading assignments were what I would call dull. Pedestrian discussions of significant issues. But 20% were thought-provoking. And it didn't matter whether you agreed with them or didn't agree with the authors. If they were thought-provoking, your mind started spinning and you gained real intellectual benefit from the ideas that were being put forward. Well, when I read The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy, this fell into the thought-provoking category, which is why I recommend it to everybody. Most books on China are written by so-called sinologists. So it's rather interesting to have somebody who does not consider himself a sinologist to address the question of China. Dr. Kissinger has done it in his book. He doesn't consider himself a sinologist. He is extremely experienced in dealing with Chinese leaders over a period of over 4 decades. But he is not a sinologist, but his book on China, Chinese have found fascinating, and many Western readers have equally found it fascinating because it makes them think about China. Now, why is this relevant? Because the ideas that Dr. Litvak is wrestling with are precisely the issues that China is wrestling with. China is facing 2 problems, which are basically strategic problems. One is the problem of the historic pattern of rising states coming into competition with established powers. And in over 2/3 of the instances, according to some historians, that results in conflict. And yet conflict will defeat China's goal to achieve the Great Awakening or revitalization of the Chinese nation, because that requires a peaceful environment so that China can concentrate on rapid economic development in order to catch up with the prosperity levels of European countries, which is what ultimately the goal is. And in the 3rd plenum of the 18th Century Central Committee that was just recently concluded, the big goal is 2049, which will be the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the People's Republic of China. And an intermediate goal is the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Communist Party in 2021. So China is thinking strategically in terms of its long-term goals in ways that American politicians are incapable of thinking of, because why should you waste your time thinking about issues when you will no longer be around? Whereas China's leaders have every reason to believe that they have a 10-year period during which they can try to accomplish things. Now, so the one problem that China faces is this managing the strategic competition with the United States. And the effort to address that is embodied in this concept of trying to create a new type of great power relationship, which is widely understood in the region, including by America's closest friends and allies. Japan, for example, tends to think of this concept as a sort of effort by China and the United States to establish a G2 relationship. Now, what is this G? I mean, G basically represents group. And we have the G20 and we had the G7. Previously, it was a G6, and then it became a G8. Essentially, these are groups that sort of bring together the most influential people on that particular area, and they sort of set guidelines, ground rules for how others should behave. Well, China and the United States have both formally and informally rejected the concept of a G2 because they both understand that what's the point of having a G2 if everybody else rejects that? In other words, the United States and China are not in a position to set rules for others. But the real purpose of the new type of great power relationship is to bring the strategic rivalry under control so you don't have a repetition of history. That's what the purpose of the new type of great power relationship is about. And the question is it doable? Well, that requires a lot of thought. And you have to look at history, and you have to understand what the problems are. And Dr. Levac's book contributes ideas that are helpful in thinking about that. But the second problem, which is perhaps even more directly relevant to the book, is China is caught in this problem that its rise creates anxiety on the part of the countries around it, and China is also burdened with historical territorial disputes left over from history, in most cases involving inconsequential bits of territory, but there are historical legacies that affect how one looks at them. And as Dr. Levac mentioned, as usual, people think there may be resources involved. And this is particularly true in the South China Sea, where the question of claims may relate to who controls the underwater resources, whether it's oil or gas or what. And this is burdening China because as it becomes stronger and economically more developed, it wants to use its growing strength to more effectively deal with China's territorial sovereignty issues. But if it behaves that way, it then damages its relations with the countries around it. And that increases their anxiety about China's rise, and they turn to the United States for assistance in helping to balance China's power, and that's not what China is trying to accomplish. So we have these two strategic problems that China is wrestling with. How do you control the dynamic of great power rivalry when you're the rising power, but you're dealing with a stronger established power? And secondly, how do you use your power in a circumstance where other countries will resist efforts by you to use your power to accomplish your national goals? This is being actively debated in China. And the locus for the debate has to do with the Deng Xiaoping concept, reflected in the Chinese phrase "Tao Guang Yang Hui," which is sometimes translated as to hide your abilities and bide your time, which has a certain threatening aspect to it. But what it really means is, because it's a set of statements, it really means keep a low profile, don't grasp for leadership, but it's not a call for passivity, because there's also a phrase which says you must have some accomplishments. The idea is that you develop yourself without pushing yourself forward. And this has been the guiding concept for China throughout much of the last 30 years, and it's now under serious attack inside China by those who think that with China now having the second largest economy in the world, it should have a foreign policy that is more commensurate with China's growing economic and military power. And that requires a more activist, assertive foreign policy, if you will. And the problem is that creates reactions. Now, the logic of strategy, which Dr. Lotvac talks about, was actually discovered by Newton. It's a physics principle in his laws of motion. And it's essentially that every action has an equal reaction. And as he puts it, the logic is always the same. Action, in this case, the growth of power, evokes reaction. Or another way of phrasing it, the logic of strategy mandates growing resistance to growing power. So a fundamental element in his book is this concept that China decreases its power by trying to increase its power too rapidly, because the reaction has the consequence of diminishing the relative power standing of China. And in drawing the German parallel that he referred to, he concludes that Imperial Germany at the end of the 19th century would have been much better served that only a militarily non-threatening and diplomatically conciliatory grand strategy could have served Germany well, accelerating its peaceful rise to new heights of cultured prosperity. If Germany, in other words, had followed Deng Xiaoping's guidance of keeping a low profile, concentrating on economic development, and not throwing its weight around, it would have been a much more effective strategy than the strategy resulted in the devastating consequences of World War I. So we're talking about very big issues here. And the question is this, and I use the author's word, somewhat deterministic approach to the idea of growing power, which is that growing power produces growing resistance. Is this an accurate way or a sufficient way to look at the issues involved in China's rise? And here I would suggest that there are some additional elements that need to be brought into play. The first is we have to consider two different possibilities. What would the consequences of China's rapid rise be if the United States were not an actor in the Western Pacific? In other words, let's take the United States out of the picture. Now, my reaction to reading Dr. Luttwak's book was that in many ways, he's dealing with that situation. In other words, he's talking about how Asian countries around China, lacking the ability individually to stand up to China, have to react by forming coalitions and trying to work against China. And ultimately, it has geopolitical economic consequences, which is that they must seek to hold down China's growth. Now, he doesn't exclude the United States from the picture, but I would argue that the United States' role in the Western Pacific alters this dynamic. Because China, even if it grows much stronger, is not going to be in a position to dominate East Asia as long as the United States remains credibly engaged. So the real problem now is that there are concerns about the United States because of our underperforming economy as to whether or not we can remain credibly engaged over the period of China's rise, and that is a necessary element in terms of how the countries around China will be responding. And that's what this rebalancing policy in East Asia is all about. It's an effort to convince the countries of East Asia that the United States will remain reliably, sustainably engaged in East Asia, and then you have a potentially different dynamic with China. And the second aspect of China, which isn't fully addressed in the book, is that unlike the Soviet Union, China's rise is benefiting all of the countries of Asia, including particularly Japan. Everyone in Asia recognized that China's economy now is the engine of growth in the region. And all of the United States' closest friends and allies in East Asia now have more trade with China than they have with the United States. This is totally different from the Soviet pattern of maintaining control around. So the dynamic in East Asia is one of the countries of East Asia want responsible Chinese behavior, in which case they will be pursuing trade relations with China and other types of cooperative relationships. But if China behaves responsibly, then they want the United States more heavily engaged in East Asia as a way of balancing China's rise. So the dynamic is not one of simply action and reaction. The dynamic is one that rewards responsible behavior, whether by China or by the United States, and which has disincentives if either country behaves irresponsibly. Now, why do I apply it to the United States? Because the test in Asia for the United States, in terms of how we are handling our power, is how do we handle our relationship with China? Because if we manage our relationship with China in a way that enhances the likelihood of responsible Chinese behavior, then all of the countries of East Asia benefit, and they see the United States as contributing to that benign outcome. But if we behave in a way that riles China, they are permanent neighbors of China, and that means they have to live in the vicinity of an angry, frustrated power being blocked by the United States, and none of China's neighbors, including Japan, wants the United States to be riling China. So there's an incentive for us to behave responsibly, and as we've watched in this dynamic of the last few years where China has tried to throw its weight around, gotten a negative reaction, pulled back a bit, then has new incentives to be more assertive, and it hasn't solved that dynamic yet. And part of the problem is because China's success in developing its economy is creating stronger Chinese nationalism, which wants China to be more assertive in defending its territorial interests. And the problem for China is there's a fundamental contradiction between the concept of peaceful development and the concept of firmly upholding China's sovereignty and territorial interests. And how do you resolve that problem? We don't know the answer yet. For example, President Xi Jinping strings the two ideas together in the same sentence. We will resolutely stick to the path of peaceful development, and we will resolutely uphold China's sovereignty and national interests. But we have a situation where these island territories and the land territories, as on the Sino-Indian border, in the Sino-Indian case, China controls the key territory in dispute. In the Senkaku Diaoyu Island dispute, Japan exercises administrative control over the islands. In the South China Sea, we have a mixed picture, where some of the territory is controlled by the various claimants and some of the territory is controlled by China. So how do you uphold your territorial interests peacefully in a situation where other claimants are already occupying the territory that you want? The problem in all three of these cases, the Indian border, the East China Sea problems, and the South China Sea, is there is no framework for dealing with these issues. There's a semi-framework in the South China Sea through the Joint Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, which, if turned into a code of conduct down there, could have a beneficial impact in lowering tensions. But for the Senkaku's Diaoyu issue, there is no frame, and the same is true of the Indian border. Taiwan is actually a benign factor in this because there is a framework for dealing with that issue. And it's reflected in the fact that tensions across the Taiwan Strait are lower now than they have been in the last, well, since 1949, really, because of the rapid expansion of common economic interests across the Taiwan Strait. So what I am presenting is the idea that perhaps we are not seeing a deterministic, mechanistic dynamic at work. We have a dynamic at work which can actually be influenced by policy decisions. And this is where a retired diplomat looks at issues perhaps somewhat differently from a strategist. Because when I sat in the State Department, if you faced a foreign policy problem, especially if you were an American diplomat, meaning that you represented a country that had sufficient power to make a difference in altering the way that international relations would develop, the question was not to passively assume that there was some inexorable law at work that you would be a victim of. It was to create circumstances that would alter the situation. And this was the insight that President Nixon, with the help of Dr. Kissinger, brought to the breakthrough strategically to China in 1971, which none of the strategists at the time saw as feasible. And you could have argued against it on a variety of grounds, but it worked. And it altered the course of the Cold War. So in a sense, that's what the United States and China is trying to do now. to not let themselves be bound by inexorable laws, but to see if there is a way to create a new type of great power relationship. Now, if you read Dr. Luttwak's book, you will recognize how difficult that process is, because the so-called inexorable laws that are referred to here are really laws of human nature. But everybody knows that human nature creates conflict, but it also resolves conflict. And therefore, there's nothing inexorable about it, except that the process goes on. And if you're successful in working effectively with others, which is what Dr. Luttwak is suggesting China needs to do, this great power autism that is fundamental to his concept is that China is lacking the ability to communicate with the countries around it because it's so committed to its own ideas. So there's a breakdown in communication and feedback mechanisms. Well, I don't think there's a total feedback, because you do see a sine curve in the way China is dealing with these issues. It's sometimes more assertive, and then when it has negative consequences, it pulls back. But my conclusion is basically that you will think more intelligently about these types of issues if you take a look at the book. But the conclusion I come to is a little bit different when I think about strategy, because there's another book that has recently been published called Strategy, A History, and you've probably taken a glimpse at that. And one of the conclusions in that is that the best strategic practice may now consist in forming compelling accounts of how to turn a developing situation into a desirable outcome. And it seems to me that is the big strategic issue in dealing with China's rise. How do we turn this developing situation into a favorable outcome? And there, I think that we need policy innovation rather than simply feeling that we are guided by inexorable laws of action and reaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Roy. Just want to point out that in breaking down these notions of inexorability and determinism, Ambassador Roy is, of course, paying homage to the late, great Peter O'Toole, who screamed across the desert that nothing is written. And so I'd like to hear a response to that.
And who just died.
And right, yesterday. So if I'd like to give you, Professor Luttwak, a chance to respond first to Ambassador Roy. And it does seem to me, just to frame the question a little bit, that he did cast some doubts on your initial fat man in the elevator analogy. What happens when the fat man actually grows the elevator and helps everybody else to gain weight in a healthy way?
I'm not going to disagree with, start quibbling, arguing with such a set of remarks I just heard. But they made me think. And so instead of retreating, I will now proclaim a more deterministic version of it and say the following. America has a certain level of actual power. The military power, of course, is very huge, a huge power, but total power is much more than that. However, my deterministic statement is that whenever U.S. military power, in a broader sense, political, psychological, economic, is not sufficient to contain the Chinese perceived pressure, the local countries coalesce to make up for it. One day, of course, if Chinese power continues to rise, their ability to coalesce may not be sufficient. But at that point, Moscow, which has been out of this game, the Russians, would step in. That's why, being an American taxpayer, I'm not enthusiastic about a very aggressive pivot at all, because I fear that this aggressive pivot would discourage these rich, powerful, capable countries, like they're growing themselves quite reasonably, India, Japan, Vietnam, all, Singapore, all of these countries that used to be neutrals, or at least only one really was a treaty ally of them, When they don't sufficiently balance China, Moscow, instead of being equidistant, starts moving against China and joining this coalition. And Moscow has blackmail capability on China in regard to things like oil and gas pipelines. It appears, as you know, that the Russians have had their first strategic discussion with Japan just in the last 2 months. First time ever. They come to Tokyo and they say, let's talk strategy. Never before. So I continue to assert that only determinism, I don't really believe that, but intellectually, I just put Russia into the picture, and that makes the inexorable argument a little stronger. The final thing I'd like to say is that all your observations in regard to China, one should add two little things. One is that everything you said about the downshipping thought does not have to be thought of as anachronistic, because it was reiterated in a 7,000-character Dai Bingguo statement, which everybody approved on. The same James Bijan was involved in that, and that's a man that Xi Jinping chose to present himself in the People's Daily after the third plenum. In other words, we're not going back to Deng Xiaoping. We're talking very recent, very recent. So everything you said is very up to date in that regard. And the only thing about it, and that is why adventurism worries me, is that whenever I raise the 7,000-character thing with Dai Bingguo, whenever I point out that this was a James Bijan operation, whenever I point out that James Bijan is not an old guy, I haven't known him for like 30 years, 40 years maybe, but because he was the guy that Xi Jinping considers his scribe, okay? The military people always say the same thing. These are old guys. This is, all these people, they don't know. And my problem is that I think they don't know. They think that having a prototype aircraft carrier is having a carrier force. Between the prototype and the force is 15 years, etc. But certainly, I learned a lot. Thank you. And you talked about my book, which, of course, I was too bashful to do myself. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let's go to questions and comments from the audience. I think it's a smaller room. Oh, we do have a mic. Great. So why don't we Sandy, just start right there in the back. Rose. And if we could keep, because we've got about a half an hour, if we could please keep initial questions or comments as brief as possible. Everybody will get a chance to speak. Thank you.
I'm Rose Chen, was born and raised in Taiwan. I enjoyed the discussion. I have a comment and a little question. China's rise is unprecedented. Chinese, they don't even know how to handle this. So using the Germany, the things to project the direction that China might evolve, I think it's, to me, it's questionable, But a lot of people think the Chinese has only one voice, but actually the foreign policy is an extension of the domestic concerns. And even though China is an old civilization, but it's like an adolescence on the international stage. They have a newfound muscle and hormone is going strong. So can you make a comment, the panel, about the different voices within China? It might dictate at one time the action that China is taking, maybe to satisfy a certain segment of the domestic concerns. Thank you.
Only reason to mention Germany, which sinologists have done before I did, is because it's a country that could have won everything by not having an army and a navy. That's all they had to do. And that is China's position. It's very unusual that you can win everything just by selling your navy for scrap. And then all the countries around you come to Beijing and they want to give you all the power and influence. That is the reason to mention Germany, no other reason. It's a very unusual situation to be, that you can win by disarming. That was the German case, it's the Chinese case today. As for disagreements, I myself mentioned, but I would like to hear perhaps your view on that, about the internal division and so on.
I touched on this in my remarks when I referred to the debate over the Deng Xiaoping concept. That's a very active debate, and if you wanted to oversimplify it, you could talk about hawks and doves. Those who want a more assertive strategy, and those who want who believe that keeping a low profile is the most effective way for China to rise. What's different in China right now is that you now have an instant national public opinion. And you've never had that before in China until the emergence of this internet blogosphere. And while the blogosphere is censored at the edges, in large measure it's post-censorship, meaning that you can get a national reaction to something quickly, and if it seems to be going too far, then they'll clamp down on it. But you get that initial reaction. And when you talk to government officials, you find that now public opinion is a much more important factor in terms of decision-making in Beijing. And this has both good and bad consequences, because Chinese nationalism, for example, on issues related to Japan, tends to want more assertive behavior. And more assertive behavior may not be in China's best interest. But if you don't take the assertive action, then public opinion tends to turn against the government. And there's a long pattern of this in China's history. You remember Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped in 1936 because he was not considered to be sufficiently anti-Japanese. And he claimed he was released with no compromises, but in fact he adopted a more firm position against the Japanese. And in 1937, Japan invaded China, destroyed Chiang Kai-shek's best troops, and this was part of the process of Chiang Kai-shek losing his grip on the mainland. So that nationalism and this debate in China is very significant because it affects not only China's external environment, but it also affects the view of the legitimacy of China's rulers. Because if they are not seen as adequate upholders of China's national interests, then people criticize them and feel that perhaps replacements would be better. And this is something the leaders in China are very conscious of and very concerned about, which is why they try to control this debate and not let it go in the wrong directions.
Michael Yehuda, up here on this side.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask two questions perhaps on the more deterministic side of things. One is the issue with Japan involves questions of China's access to the Pacific. And in that sense, it seems to me that there's a military strategic dimension to Japan in particular, because Japan, together with Taiwan, the Philippines, and so on, really limit the capacity of China's Navy to get into the Western Pacific. And this is seen as something which is necessary within China. The second question about determinism is the fact that China is run by a Communist Party. And one of the first speeches of Xi Jinping was to refer to the Soviet Union as an example that China should not follow, and he used this in particular reference to the armed forces and so on. But in addition to that, it means that there's a degree of insecurity of linkage with the West and linkage with the United States in particular, because under Xi Jinping as well, there's been a renewed emphasis against what they regard as forces of Westernization. And I'd like comments on that. Thank you.
Well, as you know, there is a very weak phenomenon of Westernization and a very strong phenomenon of self-Westernization. it's not that the West is doing something to China. We are trying to do everything we can. It is the undeclared basic stance of the United States is that we are subverting every government in the world every single day, because we are always inventing new rights and new claims and so on and so forth. Right now, the U.S. State Department is going around the world telling everybody that they should have, the freedom, sexual freedom, transgender freedoms and so on. We go around the world upsetting people and so on. That is America. Americans have been doing this since the day, maybe before the United States was established. So they have a reason to be afraid of that. But in regard to not being able to get to the Pacific, because you have the Philippines, Taiwan, and Japan there, and first of all, the Philippines is not exactly a great naval power. Taiwan is not increasingly in the lee of the Chinese power, not standing in it. And if you look at the map, you can see there's enough room to pass by these islands. As a matter of fact, there is immense ocean space. So this kind of second island chain and all that talk, this is what is a subspecies of strategic discourse called navalism. And navalism is a kind of disease, And again, I go back to Germany, because in Germany, the public opinion that prevented rational government in Berlin before 1914 was very much pushed by navalism and creating essential constraints on government choices and so on and so forth. Navalism is not in reality a form of strategy. It is a pathology of strategy. It's a disease of strategy. There's nothing in it. Between those islands, you can come and go. Your power over them, especially today, depends on your space control, the overhead space control, and all kinds of other factors, not the islands in between.
State Benny.
I basically agree with the comment, which is on the first part of your question. While in an all-out war situation, maybe control of those islands would have some relevance. But in modern war, certainly during World War II, it was important, because it was a question of where you could locate an air base and where you could have surveillance operations. But in a world of satellites and long-range missiles and things of this sort, it seems to me that on its eastern flank, China is not blocked from access to the Western Pacific. If you talk about going to the Indian Ocean, then it has an unresolvable problem in terms of very narrow straits. So if it puts substantial naval forces to the west of the Strait of Malacca, there could be problems in a conflict situation. There's a propaganda film, as you're probably aware, that's circulating in China now, that was produced both by the military and the Academy of Social Sciences, which is essentially a outrageous presentation of the view that the cooperative strategy of the West with China is simply a subversive strategy to try to subvert China from within. It's a new variant of the old peaceful evolution strategy. I mean, how China let itself fall into the absurd position of thinking of peaceful evolution as a subversive concept. And I used to raise, when I was ambassador in China, I raised this with Zheng Bijian and everybody else in the communist leadership that I could meet. And I said, everybody knows that peaceful evolution is good. And you let it become a bad term. And they said, well, it wasn't my term. That's how everyone referred to it.
Yeah,
it wasn't my term.
It was inherited.
And of course, it goes back to John Foster Dulles, who had a concept of internal subversion, and they read State Department speeches sometimes and think that we're still thinking of subverting China from within. Maybe so. There is that school that worries about China getting too close to the West, but I think that at the policy level, that concept is largely rejected. So that I don't think that I see this as a sort of a Tea Party element inside China trying to push a line that is not going to have broad public residence.
This corner of the table, please.
Thank you. The panel discussion has been fascinating. My name is Chunhua Chen. I'm from the George Washington University. So if I'm not mistaken, Professor Lodwak's, one of the messages that you sent to China is that you shall not quarrel with your neighbors, which I agree. But I think the world is still full of realists, and both defensive realists like Kenneth Ward and offensive realists like John Mearsheimer would predict that no matter what China does as a rising power, its rise will trigger the coalesce of its the coalesce of an anti-China alliance among its neighboring countries. So the logic could be, even if China does not want to quarrel its neighbors will coalesce against it. What should China do? And relevant to that, I was reading reports on the confrontation between the Chinese warship and the USS Cowpens yesterday. Although all of the reports were emphasizing that, of course, the English language reports were emphasizing that the confrontation happened in the international waters, I could not help noticing that the USS Cowpens was actually conducting surveillance activities on the Liaoning, the Liaoning ship. So what should China have responded in such a circumstance, given that its carrier has been watched closely by US surveillance ship? Thank you.
Yeah, you're more deterministic than I am. You're saying it's okay, no matter what China does, it would cause the same exact reactions. Well, that is why you have a government. That's why you have diplomats. Precisely knowing that this is what the inexorability would be, you do what China did, which is the peaceful rise. Peace, say, war, we're not going to do it, reassurance. Reassuring your neighbors is part of rising. Reassuring your neighbors. And that is what successful great powers do. They reassure in order to avoid their neighbors from making alliances against them. And that is the thing. And the second thing about inevitability here, in the case of the revival of the Arunachal Pradesh South Tibet dispute, the initiative came exactly from one side, only from China. Every single action was Chinese, starting with the Manila thing. In regard to the Philippines, I don't believe that the Filipinos did anything, actually. They were simply reacted, and the activity was on the Chinese side. The passport published in China with a big map showing all of these claims, that was not printed in Washington, it was printed in Beijing. So in other words, even precisely when you have the natural reaction to rising power, you're supposed to be ultra conciliatory, extra nice, and that is what the policy was for many years. And therefore, it makes no sense at all to change and we're not dealing with sense or nonsense, but we're dealing with emotion. Now, in regard to the ship, the Liaoning and the flotilla were there, and they had every right to be there. So did the United States had every right to be there within any normal distance of ship avoidance collision, which is a few miles. If you all for decades, for 50 years, 40 years, every time one of our aircraft carriers was moving, there was a Soviet tattletale, a little converted fishing boat type that was much closer than 40 kilometers. They were right next to. And all this happened, we never had an incident. In all those years, the Russian Navy and the US Navy, Russian Air Force, US Air Force were meeting all the time. We never had an incident. Why? Because the Russian military were under classic Marxist-Leninist orders no adventurism. Don't try and make a career by showing how tough you are, how bold you are, because you will be fired, you'll be punished, you'll be demoted. That is why I'm concerned, Ambassador, because I believe that the incentives are different. I believe that the Lanzhou military region guy who said, let's cross the border, grab that entrance to the pass, I don't believe he was demoted. I don't believe he was fired. I don't believe that the fellow who ordered the land tanking ship to go and block the cow pens the other day will be fired. And the reason why there was no conflict between the Soviets and Americans was because any commander who was adventuristic was immediately fired. And they're not being fired in China at all. And this is worrisome about the issue of command and control.
Just briefly comment, both the U.S. military and the Chinese military are downplaying this incident. Secondly, during the Cold War, it was standard practice between the United States and the Soviet Union as Dr. Levesque pointed out, the Russians would send in ships, to surveil our carrier task forces. U.S. ships would shoulder them aside if they got too close. This created the danger of collisions, but minor collisions, because this was shouldering, sort of side-to-side brushing. But some collisions occurred, and we negotiated an incident-at-sea agreement with the Russians that essentially established ground rules for how dangerous your maneuvers could be in trying to prevent too close in surveillance. Until now, China has shown no interest in having such an agreement. I think that a useful outcome of this latest incident would be to revive interest in trying to establish some ground rules. We're talking about international waters. As Dr. Levesque says, the Chinese have every reason to be there, but so do we. And if they have a new carrier out there, we're going to be interested in it, and our ships are going to surveil them, and that's what navies do. But I may be speaking wrongly, so I'm going to ask my friend Admiral McVaden. Do you have anything, Eric, to add on this subject?
And you have the next question as well, so.
Good, thank you. Yes, Eric McVaden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Yes, I was involved to a significant degree in the incidents at sea talks. To begin with, as the officer deck of an aircraft carrier and having the Soviets turn across my bow in the middle of the night when we were launching airplanes and so forth. And of course, the incidents at sea agreement did arrive at a solution to that. And I later went to Moscow as part of the team that resolved those issues annually. And it did work, and I agree with you. It seems that that's something that would be a worthwhile outcome now. My question, at Sunnylands, the two presidents, Obama and Xi Jinping, came up with the concept of a new paradigm in relations between countries. I wonder if that is simply fluff, or if that holds out some hope, if maybe there are components that we could develop of that would assist us in this current situation where the Chinese have once again become so aggressive in their foreign policy, and that we just might have the basis for at least beginning to talk about it, for considering what are the building blocks that we would like to put into this supposed new arrangement, or is that just something that's going to be lost in history?
Let me address that first off. There are two components to this related, and I touched on this in my comments on Dr. Levesque's presentation. The formal language is a new type or new model of great power relations, which is what they're talking about in terms of this new paradigm. Both sides have endorsed that concept, that we need to explore that. And as I put it, the purpose of the new type of great power relationship is to prevent history from repeating itself in terms of a rising power and established power getting into vicious rivalry between each other. And there is growing rivalry between the two militaries in the Pacific, and that's the question. The second aspect of it is President Xi Jinping has stated I believe it was at Sunny Lands, but he may have been in other things. He says the Pacific Ocean is large enough for both China and the United States. In other words, it's another way of saying a point that China has repeatedly emphasized, that it's not trying to drive the United States out of the Western Pacific. That's its declared policy. Now, whether their behavior over time is going to be consistent with that, we'll have to see. But my personal view is the United States is not going to be driven out of the Western Pacific. And therefore, it would be a confrontational policy if China were to adopt that as part of its strategy, which I don't think it will.
Well, avoiding confrontation is the aim of both sides, but they cannot do so by an arrangement which is perceived by our friends and allies as a G2, in the sense of a ganging up on, the China-America get together against them. So it's a delicate thing to do, but the minimum condition is precisely to have rules of the road, such as those that were established with your participation. And if we do not have these rules of the road, on our way to achieving other things, an incident could very easily blow up and cause a drastic change of direction, which is what happened between Japan and China. It was an incident on the Senkaku that led to the drastic change. Just remember, if only 3 years passed from Ozawa in Beijing to the attack on athletic sports shops in small Chinese cities, small of only 2 million inhabitants and so on, because they thought they were Japanese shops. 3 years passed. So an incident between countries can develop in uncontrollable ways, and that is why the issue of incentives, in my view, is crucial. The incentives which are being given in a system of creating as opposed to avoiding trouble. That's the problem.
I think we have time for 2 more quick questions, if you can, and then final question. Okay.
Kent Hughes at the Wilson Center. Thank you for a very thought-provoking panel. I wanted to ask about the northern border and if there's something over the long term that might occur there. With ethnic Russians gradually leaving Siberia and ethnic Chinese more and more of an immigrant force in Siberia, do you foresee a Kosovo-like situation in which you have a de jure Russian control, but de facto it's almost a Chinese province?
Well, if you go to Moscow, you can hear people say that. If you then travel and you say, well, Moscow is not yet Chinese controlled, you say, oh yes, we go to Khabarovsk, there it's all Chinese. You get to Khabarovsk and you see that the same Chinese that there always were there, day traders and so on, is not true, there's no invasion going on. Then you say, oh yes, but here it's okay, but if you go to Komsomolsk on Amur, it's all over and so on. You get there are no Chinese there. In other words, I do not believe that it's an osmosis issue there. I don't believe that the first ever Russian visit to Tokyo to talk strategy, maybe the first ever, right? I don't believe they were talking strategy ever before, was due to the osmosis issue. I believe it's due to the global balance of power issue. In a given balance of power, Moscow can pursue the domestic political aim of quarreling with the United States, which is a requirement if you are Putin or a dictator or something. If, however, Russia finds itself in a world which is China-dominated because the Americans are not strong enough, then they have to do the alliance-gathering job. And I think this is what they're reacting to. In regard to Siberia, by the way, the imminent thing which is happening now, as we speak, is large-scale Japanese investment that was blocked by the Japanese government into Siberia now being released. For all those years, the Japanese government told the Japanese companies, don't invest in Siberia. Now they're saying to them, invest in Siberia. That will make a difference in terms of how many people live there.
One final question. Yes, sir.
My name is Stephen Shore. My question is, do you see China supporting the government of North Korea indefinitely, or might there come a time when whatever patience there is for this regime in Beijing ceases, and what would the consequences be?
Well, I'd like to hear Ambassador Roy, but I'll just say that I don't believe that one of the least necessary quarrels, the least necessary Chinese quarrel, is with the Republic of Korea. Republic of Korea is the only country that I saw entering voluntarily the Chinese orbit, voluntarily becoming China's client state, until the Chinese decided to kick them as well in the shins over some submerged rock or something of the sort. But in any case, I don't believe anybody ruling in Beijing is eager to have a Republic of Korea directly on its borders, so long as the Republic of Korea is the ally of the United States and so on. So there's a strategic reason to support, to tolerate North Korean regime, which they maybe never liked, and probably like even less. But there's no reason not to tolerate them when the alternative is to have a regime of which you have much less potential influence. Potential, I would say. Anyway.
Just very briefly, I think your question related to North Korea and the recent developments there, including the execution of the uncle by marriage. China is going to be very concerned about this. China does not want regime change or regime collapse in North Korea because of the uncertainties as to what would emerge from that and the possibility of outside power intervention in some way, including Republic of Korea intervention if you had a collapse of government authority in North Korea. China's concern will be, is the young leader consolidating his position through these extraordinary measures against now his own family, or is he in fact destabilizing the situation by convincing others within the power establishment that they may be next, and therefore generating people opposed to his rule as opposed to consolidating his position? This will be the key concern on the part of China. China's position is that it doesn't interfere in such matters, but it's intensely interested in that question because it has enormous consequences for China if the young leader proves unable to maintain stability in North Korea, which would open a Pandora's box of potential adverse consequences.
Thank you, Ambassador Roy, and thank you, Professor Litwack, for coming out this morning. I'd also like to give a sort of year-ending thanks to all of you. This will be our last public program of 2013. I have had emails from a number of you about suggesting new programs that you'd like to see the Kissinger Institute hold, public programs. This is most welcome. So please feel free to be in touch if you think that there are things that we're missing or other kinds of programs that we could be adding onto sort of the slate that we have at the Kissinger Institute. I can't promise to do all of them, but very much want your feedback and wanted to wish you happy holidays and a very happy new year. Hope to see you early in 2014. Thank you.
I just said, I doubled down.